the title from the first draft. And I really liked that it was this kind of like tongue-in-cheek title for a book that is about a sort of upwardly mobile but downwardly spiraling Black 20-something.
I'm Nathan Maharaj. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is the novelist Rob Franklin. His debut novel, Great Black Hope, is about a young man named Smith who gets arrested for cocaine possession on his way home from a party at the end of an oppressively hot New York summer. Smith is black and he's queer. He's also a Stanford graduate, and his family back in Atlanta is, as they say, not without means. As Smith's court date looms and he enters treatment for addiction, he's also grieving the sudden and tragic death of a friend. Rob Franklin, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for having me.
I want to start by asking about our protagonist's name. David Smith Jr., I suppose, is his full name. That's way more syllables than he's accustomed to using to refer to himself in the book. He Googles himself early on. He's relieved to learn that the criminal justice system already has a bunch of David Smiths in processing, so he's obscured in a crowd. Why give this character a name that's the closest thing to not having a name at all?
Yeah, so I mean, as you mentioned, the character's name is David Smith Jr., but he goes by Smith. And that kind of the anonymity of his name factors into the plot, in part because early on after his arrest, he's very nervous that because it happened in a kind of small town like Southampton, that it might be printed in a local newspaper, but he's sort of protected by the anonymity of his name. In fact, that there are many David Smiths getting arrested all the time for all sorts of things. But I really liked the idea of Smith as this, in a way, a kind of everyman, because so often he's this like cipher for these different worlds that he's moving through. And he can be like in a scene kind of a passive presence, but also like a really acute observer. And so I sort of liked this idea that he was a kind of everyman, but also that he's taken this family name that he shares with his father, and he's chopped it down to just be Smith, almost as like a mononym, so that it becomes kind of like distinct and almost like sort of fashionable.
Yeah.
Like he's forged a sort of like individual identity out of what is otherwise a kind of non-name.
I do imagine him leaving that party and someone saying, "Oh, who's the tall guy that just left?" And it's, "Oh, that's Smith."
For sure. I mean, I also kind of like, there's so many associations that I feel like people have brought up with that name of like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, like the idea of a kind of almost like, yeah, like weaponized anonymity is yeah, I like all of those kind of connotations and associations people are drawing.
Yeah. At the very beginning of the book, this arrest happens so fast. I had to reread it a couple of times because I was like, "Who are these men? Are these really cops?" And it was a great scene. It was a great deployment of real literary concision. It's actually, I realize I've written it down here. It's the fourth paragraph in the novel, and it's not even in the first chapter. It's in the prologue. Why drop that so fast and so hard on the reader that we've just met this character and now this is the thing that's happened to him?
Yeah, the kind of inciting incident. Yeah, it's funny because I mean, so much has changed from first draft to now, but that was kind of always the opening. And it was always in prologue rather than in the first chapter, this sort of like prose poem prologue opening where Smith is arrested on the last day of a kind of sweltering New York summer. And I think that the language in that section has a voice and a tone that's slightly distinct from a lot of the rest of the prose. Like as I just said, I think of it as a prose poem. There's a kind of like clarity, a concision, a lyricism that's like at other points, I think the kind of narrative voice of the novel is a little bit more like expansive and at times even like meandering. But in that opening scene, we get this kind of, this voice that's almost mirroring Smith's mental state, which like he's just taken a bump of cocaine and suddenly like everything is kind of crystal clear. And yet it's also sort of surreal to him. And so in that scene, you mentioned that you almost missed it, that he got arrested. He also almost misses it. He has this sort of like amused disbelief that any of this is happening to him. Because the kind of switch of him thinking that these were just like club security kicking him out, which whatever, time to go home, to him realizing that his life is permanently changed because in fact they're plainclothes police officers is in the space of an instant. And so I think that kind of concision and the sort of like almost like fraught concision of the kind of voice in the opening is to mirror his mental state.
Yeah. It also has the function of making us question who this person is that we've just met, that we've just been with for just a few hundred words. And we don't know much about him, except now he's been picked up for possession of drugs, which is like, okay, fine. But I found that what I felt like was happening was all I could carry into the book, because it had just started, was my assumptions as a person who lives in the world. And that was a sticky place to be, as I learn this young black man has just been arrested for cocaine possession.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these assumptions I've got are come flooding in as I'm trying to read the book. Tell me about setting up the reader with this as the introduction to our protagonist.
Yeah, I love what you just said. And I think that was something from a craft perspective on some level I was trying to do, but no one has actually stated that as clearly, which is like, we understand that this is a young black man who's just been picked up for, criminal possession of powder cocaine, and, charged with a crime, charged with a felony. And the reader, in the absence of any additional information about Smith, will probably bring a lot of existing narratives and kind of like, just cultural detritus from like, from history, from pop culture, about what it means for a young black man to be kind of ensnared in the criminal justice system and where this story is going as a result. I think immediately images from the sort of war on drugs and black men in the carceral system and behind bars kind of come to mind for a lot of readers. And then over the course of the following chapters, we learn about the ways in which Smith's kind of class privilege actually insulates him in many ways from the sort of law's full fist. And so there's almost a bait and switch there that I think I was excited to impose upon the reader.
I was delighted to be baited. It's great. One of the other things we get early on, as you mentioned, his class privilege, but it's kind of gently signaled at. Like we kind of walk up to it a little slowly. And one of the first signals we get of it is a barrage of pretty highbrow literary references. Like I think in one paragraph where he talks about a Christopher Isherwood novel that he wishes he'd paid more attention, he would spend more time with, and that somebody else is reading Proust. Smith's world is refined. It's not just about money. It's refined in a way money can't buy. Money can't make you know who Christopher Isherwood is.
Sure.
Tell me about sketching that world, giving that extra shade of color in his world.
I mean, the world that we kind of open the novel in, and the world of much of the first third of the novel, is basically Smith's life in kind of downtown New York City, and in the opening scenes in the Hamptons, staying at his best friend Carolyn's kind of family estate. And Smith is in some ways he feels like a kind of interloper in this world, or a new entry to this world, where due to, Carolyn, who is his best friend, is this sort of wealthy white woman from like an East Coast art world family. And while Smith is from the Southern Black bourgeoisie, like Carolyn is almost a member of a kind of like coastal elite, like cafe society, and has been in a way his entree into that world. But also, we learn through kind of the narration in Smith's consciousness that he is fluent in a lot of the sort of status symbols of that world, and part of that is due to his upbringing, but part of that is learned, right? Like, he knows what an Eames, how to recognize an Eames chair or, a Marnie shirt or whatever, in part because he's been spending the last several years kind of immersed in this world. And so the specificity of those kind of subtle status markers, that are never loudly spoken, is I think kind of ever present in the prose. And we also see, like, because of his outsider status, he's always aware when another person is like intentionally invoking those to try to say something about themselves. Like when somebody is doing a kind of subtle linguistic thing
Mm-hmm.
to mark their own status, Smith picks up on it because he is a kind of new entry into this world.
Mm-hmm. There's a line: dressed in designer suits, the Smiths stood out like two middle fingers in a sea of thumbs. And this is Smith Senior and Junior as they begin their journey through the criminal justice systems, father shepherding son through this horrible thing. It's funny to me now to read that line because I'm not sure I can see either of the Smiths extending middle fingers to any offensive use.
Yeah.
I think they'd have other ways of expressing that sentiment. Yet the class identifier of like fine clothing, I do imagine that would be pretty annoying, at least to the other people being,
Hmm.
about to be processed through criminal justice, possibly offensive, certainly annoying. Tell me about calibrating their class, of setting that bar of privilege
Hmm.
where it's clear that there's going to be a lot of things working in Smith's favor, but not so much that this is going to be easy.
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely interested in the idea that in some ways Smith is like menaced by his blackness in the criminal justice system. There's a lot of projections and expectations that come with it that he's kind of counteracting, but he's insulated by his class. And it's funny. I mean, I spoke to this feels like a name drop, but I was able to speak to Margot Jefferson, who's a critic and is a kind of chronicler of the Black bourgeoisie, about this book, and she pointed out that line as well about the two middle fingers and a sea of thumbs, and specifically this idea that the Black bourgeoisie are going to be known for kind of overdressing,
Mm.
because you never want to show up underdressed, because then that allows people to make the sort of assumptions they were already planning to make about you. And so that is a kind of, I think, specific affect of like the particular kind of race class intersection they're in, where I would think, David Smith Sr. and Jr., they probably assumed the first time they went to court that everyone was going to be in a suit.
Like that's what you would do. I have a court day today, so I get my good navy suit because
Yeah,
that's
like
what you wear to
you
court,
go in your
obviously.
finest suit.
Yeah.
And even once it became clear that that is not the case, that is still, they want to kind of, connote or like evoke a certain class status and a certain comportment when they're in those rooms, because they think, and they have been informed by their lawyer, that it will help to kind of humanize Smith for the judge and help to tell, even more than humanize, frankly, tell a story of, being otherwise a quote unquote good kid, a sort of like respectable professional who's not like a dangerous to society, to the judge, that will be useful to them.
Yeah, yeah, to establish the charge he's up on as a tremendous aberration in
Hmm.
his life, that this is well outside any normal conduct of this young man thus far.
Yeah, and of course it's not. Like we kind of quickly learned, like, that is his lawyer's strategy, is to frame this as a kind of one-time anomaly, um but he's a kind of habitual recreational drug user, as are most of his friends. And so there's a sort of um, there's a lie that's being told that is never said explicitly, but it's said through kind of subtle markers and symbols, conveying that he's a kind of like elite educated yuppie, and not the sort of, again, I'm using air quotes, kind of like kind of black man you expect to see in this situation. Um, that is that's like an entirely kind of strategic move.
Yeah. As you're talking, I'm reminded of a painfully awkward scene in his in one of the rehab sessions he's forced to attend. So we're going to talk about Mancini.
Oh
we're gonna
yes, please.
we're gonna talk about Mancini's horrendous online addiction treatment group therapy sessions. I don't know. I thought this guy was a textbook case of like how to be a bad therapist. We could get into like, what's your experience of therapists that you crafted this guy? We're not going to go there, but I do want to ask about um about writing these scenes where Smith has to show up and perform a certain kind of contrition's part of it, but there's
Sure.
more to it as well. Tell me about Mancini's treatment program.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think perform is the right word. I think Smith is a character to whom it is like second nature, as a result of his background, to like walk into any room and figure out what people want from him, figure out kind of what projections are being placed upon him, and either like counteract those, or revs turn the dial up on certain things to kind of achieve whatever end he wants. And so with the judge, maybe the right move is to be like, this is a one-time thing, it's not going to happen again. But with this doctor who wants to see like the appearance of contrition and emotional vulnerability, and to feel like he's kind of like helping change people's lives, even though he's completely terrible at it. The performance of that vulnerability is kind of what is being demanded by the situation, and Smith intuits that and leans in basically, and we see him also kind of gamifying and even sort of lying in those situations. But I mean, it's funny, like I think that there is humor. There are different kinds of humor in different scenes in this book.
Mhm.
But the Mancini scenes, the kind of court-ordered Skype rehab scenes, were some of the most like straightforwardly, almost like slapsticky and like really fun to write, because he just is such a ridiculous character, and also the notion that you're gonna achieve a sort of like deep communion, of like radical honesty and vulnerability, like on Skype with a bunch of strangers, led by a person who like is very inept at even just kind of like asking a simple question.
Yeah.
Um,
He's not a great listener,
yeah, it has a sort of ridiculousness to it that could be kind of played up for laughs, I think.
but on the subject of addiction, right? It means different things. And we like, as you've mentioned, like this is not a one-time thing. Smith enjoys
Mm,
drugs. He enjoys drugs recreationally. So do
yeah.
his friends, because it's part of why they're friends. It's a thing they do together. That's how they have fun together. Um, but it hits differently because
Hmm.
he presents differently. The criminal justice system handles him differently from how it handles his friends,
Hmm.
or would, were they to find themselves ensnared in it. What I really thought was interesting was that you do address like what it all means to him. That it's not there's no romantic tragic pain he's trying to escape.
Mm,
He's not suffering. He just like it's a thing he likes to feel. It's
hmm.
you kind of take all the air out of this stigmatized thing of this criminal activity. Um uh Tell me about exploring that, about exploring addiction and the symbol of using narcotics.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the kind of dichotomy you just mentioned of like the symbolic significance of kind of like the word addict, or like the exterior um presentation of being an addict versus like the interior experience of kind of like consuming drugs, I think is definitely something that's very different for Smith and something I wanted to explore. So like, there's the idea in the book, I think that the word addict has a very different sort of cultural baggage when applied to different bodies, and, a lot of cultural baggage when applied to someone like Smith, just as a Black man in the world. He recognizes that in some ways that could be kind of ruinous to how he's seen in the world if he's kind of like branded or self-identified as a drug addict. And so he's navigating that. He's hyper aware of that. But then he's also having the sort of interior question of just like, what is addiction?
Mm-hmm.
And am I that? And so when he's in both the court ordered recovery, and then when he kind of starts to go to 12-step to AA meetings, he's looking around and he's hearing these stories, relating to parts of it, but also being like, am I like these people? And at one point, he is kind of analyzing definitions of the addict, and realizes that for him, drug use, it's not about, the escape from some core trauma or pain. It's more about escape from kind of the confines of embodiment and also like time in a way.
Yeah.
I think Smith is a character who really struggles with embodiment, in part because he is constantly performing himself. So like he's always so hyper aware of how he's being perceived and micro adjusting, and that is an exhausting way to move through the world. And consuming drugs is a kind of temporary release from that. And also from the sort of constant questions of like, what is he supposed to do with his life? Like the kind of family expectations that I think he feels very deeply. That is kind of what draws him to drug use and to, the night generally. But he's not sure if like that equates to a sort of chemical dependency. And which one of those is the sort of adequate definition for an addict?
Yeah. Smith's friend L is the friend who dies, and Smith's still kind of reeling from her tragic and sudden
Sure.
death. L's mom is a famous singer. Smith's own parents are quite accomplished professionals. The book being called Great Black Hope seems like a little bit of a joke based on kind of like we've been talking about Smith. He's kind of hollow. He's kind of, I want to say feckless. I think that might be too far, but feck full would be definitely wrong. So,
It's not factful. Yeah.
you're right. Like he's not a terribly driven guy.
Yeah, totally.
So just the title itself feels like a little bit of a joke. And I wanted to ask you about that phrase and when you seized upon it as the title for this book.
For sure. Yeah. So, I think I've always been sort of ambiently aware of the phrase Great Black Hope, like as applied, especially to, I think, upstarts in the world of politics. So, figures like Barack Obama and Condoleezza Rice. And so I always thought it would be, that was the title from the first draft. And I really liked that it was this kind of like tongue-in-cheek title for a book that is about a sort of upwardly mobile, but downwardly spiraling Black 20-something. And then, I think it really kind of crystallized as like the title when I was Googling the sort of history of it, different contexts in which it's been used, different people it's been applied to. And I found this profile from the 90s of Colin Powell in Vanity Fair. It was from when he was leaving a career in the military, through which he ascended very quickly. I think he was the highest ranking Black officer in the military.
Mhm.
And he was entering politics, but no one knew his politics yet. People literally didn't know his party loyalty. And the profiler was kind of holding up his background from a race class perspective to try to just understand where his like allegiances lay, and
Mhm.
also thinking a lot about how his success depended on his kind of palatability to like a white mainstream ecosystem. Um, but in that profile, it depicts Colin Powell as just like playing the game very well and very strategically, and like revealing certain information to certain people, concealing certain information from certain people, and really weaponizing his identity toward the ends that he was interested in. And that felt so related to this project.
Yeah.
Smith being this character who's moving through these different worlds and, yeah, constantly performing himself and kind of managing the perception of him from a sort of race and class perspective. And so then, you know, from then on, I was kind of sure that that was the title. And it's really only been, I guess, since more people have started reading it, that I can see that there's also a more kind of earnest read to the title. Because I do feel like, this is in some ways a book about when everything in your life or everything you think your life is kind of burns to the ground, how to begin to orient your way back toward hope. Like I do think it ends on a more kind of hopeful note. So there is that kind of double meaning, which I really like.
The narration notes there a generational divide over identity. The line is quote, identity is useful only if one was deft enough to claim the bait without tripping the door to the cage. And as you speak about people trying to decode someone's beliefs and trying to figure
Mm.
out their allegiance to an identity, I guess my question is, what's the bait in that trap, in that animal trap?
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I think the bait is the promise of some sort of like personal remuneration or progress,
Yeah.
um, at the expense of any sort of like collective or structural change, and at the expense, frankly, of like self-definition.
Mm,
When you kind of lean into a reductive idea of your identity, um, because somebody is saying that they want to celebrate that identity, quote unquote, and it's
yeah.
going to lead to kind of short-term um, like progress for yourself.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily realize that then you're trapped in this flattened version of who you're supposed to be. And I think throughout the novel, we're looking at different versions of that. Like we look at that with the Mona character, who's an artist, um, who, she basically complains of how in the sort of like public art world imagination, she has been like reduced to her politics. Nobody's actually interested in the work. They
Yeah.
want to focus on her identity. She is the story always. It's not the work. And she has this quote that's like, "You only get to play Messiah if you're willing to be the martyr." Also, like there are a lot of costs that come um, with people, yeah, especially a kind of, I guess, white, like mainstream ecosystem, turning you into like the face of XYZ community, XYZ
Hmm.
marginalized community,
Hmm.
because it doesn't allow you to be a full person.
Yeah. There's no, yeah, tokenism. It can feel like you're being elevated, but you're being elevated on a very tiny platform. There's no room for anything up there.
For sure. And it's also, I mean, it's a very individual pursuit. I mean, I've been I've been referring to this book as in some ways, like I think it's a very post-Obama era text.
Mm,
I mean, it's literally set in 2019, so it's very literally a post-Obama era text. Um, but I think in its ideas as well, like it is a book that's very skeptical of the idea that kind of like black faces in high places is like an end in itself.
yeah.
And is aware that the kind of post-race dream that was very alive and talked about during Obama's two terms, like the kind of idiocy of that has shown itself very clearly, given everything that happened after, and that having a few, of course, representation matters and is important for a thousand reasons, but having a few highly visible, highly successful Black people, quote unquote, at the top does not necessarily translate to any sort of like structural, permanent, collective change.
Yeah. Yeah. The family is described as denominationally promiscuous, which is just a marvelous turn of phrase. Let's just start with that. There are a few different churches in their rotation, is what that means. Um, Tell me about bringing religion into this and the
Mm,
role it plays in the Smith family's life.
mm, for sure. Yeah. I mean, that mostly plays a role in the kind of, middle section of the novel when we see Smith go back home to Atlanta. That section of the novel is called Down South. And in that section, I really wanted to look at the particular social codes of kind of the Southern Black bourgeoisie as distinct from, Carolyn's world, which is like the New York City kind of art, kind of waspy art world,
Mhm.
and also Elle's world, which is sort of Black Hollywood. And I think something that's really particular about the Southern Black bourgeoisie is like, you know, church is one of the main sort of social governing forces. People refer to themselves by like their church affiliation and where they go to church. It's like a members club almost. And so, I mean, I think that the Smith family, they are religious, they are practicing Christians. Smith's father is ordained, but it's also just a major part of their kind of social architecture.
Mhm.
And that is very distinct from Smith's life in New York.
The way you describe their interaction with these different churches, it does make me think about, as we were talking before, about these public figures, Black American public figures who
Mm,
who rose to just about the highest rank in their fields, and it does feel like the Smith family kind of approaches churches almost like they're like laying political groundwork or something.
mm,
It's amassing, I don't want to say power,
mm.
um, but something adjacent to power, maybe. Certainly,
Yeah, social cachet,
yeah.
maybe, and like connections. I mean, I think that that's part of it, right? Like, um, part of the value of going to these different churches, and having a sort of rotation. First of all, it's like you can kind of choose your adventure any given Sunday, but also like it broadens the social sphere, and broadens the network. Um, and it also, as we see in the text, kind of jokingly, it allows them, if they don't want to go to any of them, no one can kind of like hold them accountable because it's just like, oh, well, maybe they're at this other church that we know sometimes they go to.
I'm so glad you said that because I didn't want to leave the discussion of church without that brilliant mechanism that they've built for themselves, that they can always be elsewhere, and if they're elsewhere, they also just
Yes.
might be at the breakfast table
Yeah. Totally, totally, totally. Yeah, without losing face.
without losing face. Exactly, exactly. They've projected a version of themselves into the world that others just pick up and imagine on their behalf while they sit in their bathrobes. Um,
Yeah, totally. I mean, also that's a great thought of like, I think in general with any sort of performance, you only have to give people like two of five components and they'll complete the rest of the picture. And I think the characters in this book are very aware of that. You can make certain suggestions and people kind of complete the rest of the narrative for you.
It feels like, and this might be going stretching too far, but like Smith's got this silly, not silly, it's hilarious because it feels like the height of satire in how you describe the job he has at this company called Canvas. Of course, there are no vowels in it, but you understand the word is Canvas because vowels are passe and this is a startup. But it's all about that. It's about connecting people with connecting. What a terrible verb. Like bringing people who want to be associated with works of art in some way, and it does that. It's like I need to show how with it I am. Get me the piece of art that does that,
Mm,
and it does as you described that economical and almost abstract construction of self. It does
mm,
feel like it's understanding that Rothko level of like I just need two colors. If I give you two
mm.
colors, you'll feel like you're standing in front of an 8 foot tall canvas.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, those consumers that Smith is trying to target through his kind of content strategist job, like they're trying to assemble a life that's like synonymous with like good taste, good politics.
yeah, yeah,
And like, this is a luxury consumer good that helps them to do that.
yeah. I mean, to be clear, like Smith does not want to do this job. He'd like to mostly not do much of anything, but yes, that is his job. That's
That is his job. Yeah.
that's where the paycheck comes from. There's a journalist throughout the book who's kind of chasing characters down because she's trying to write the story of Elle's life and death.
Hmm.
Smith doesn't trust her, leaves her on red in the DMs for a while. He's not sure what he wants to do with her. It feels it feels like an inner conflict, though, because as I read in the author's note, a lot of this book was you writing through feelings of grief
Hmm.
over the loss of a friend, uh, a story from which you took pieces to write this book.
Sure.
Tell me about that journalist and where that journalist sits relative to you as novelist.
Hmm. Yeah, that's such an interesting question. Yeah, so in the book, I mean, we see Smith kind of avoiding talking to this journalist who wants to write a feature story on his friend Elle, who's passed away, died of an opiate overdose, and he does kind of successfully evade her emails, but then when the story comes out, he's very disappointed by like despite its kind of best intentions, the way that it doesn't feel like it kind of captured his friend. It doesn't feel like a totally nuanced, three-dimensional story. But of course, like, how could a journalist ever do that without
Yeah,
speaking to the people close to the person who's passed away? And so there is a kind of self-defeating aspect to him refusing to speak to the journalist. Um, and as you mentioned, in the author's note, I talk about how part of this book was inspired by my own experience of losing a good friend, which was covered really extensively in the press. Um, and in real life, I was asked to and did speak to some journalists, um, and had a kind of understandably, I think, ambivalent experience of reading a lot of those stories. But I do think, yeah, like in writing the novel, like a novel is just innately a much more capacious form than, a 7,000 word article.
yeah,
And I do think that there was a part of me subconsciously that was like, in through this fictional narrative, trying to kind of like give a sense of nuance and three-dimensionality and like expansiveness to a story that can so easily be collapsed into symbols, and used to kind of drive clicks and traffic. And so to kind of um, return to the sort of humanity of these characters.
mm. Having written the book, having had to live with the book the way an author does through edits and rewrites, Um, do you feel like you've processed that grief any
Mm.
better? Did this work, or you know, or is this,
Yeah,
yeah.
I think so. I mean, I guess only time will tell. I think that part of the experience of losing a friend in a very public way, I mean, like Smith, we all found out from tabloids, um, was that I was not able to process it in a kind of immediate way, because I was immediately being asked to kind of articulate it.
While
Within,
having it articulated at you as well.
yes, right. And also having a kind of, various competing narratives and, the kind of role of media narrative versus like private grief and processing was very ramped up, which I mean, I think that that's a dynamic that everyone deals with in a kind of internet age is grieving in public to some degree.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that I then like moved to Berlin, tried to work on a different project, made a bunch of friends who knew nothing about that sort of like traumatic, tragic incident that I had been so close to. Um, and basically tried to kind of run away both inside my head and quite literally like moving continents. And so I think coming back to New York and like confronting this story and these feelings and all of kind of my own unprocessed grief and sadness and anger and confusion, through the lens of fiction, um, did help me just work through a lot of feeling and a lot of ideas as well.
Mhm. Rob, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. This was so great.
I have been speaking with Rob Franklin, author of Great Black Hope. Find it at Kobo in Conversations home on the web, kobo.com/conversation. There's a link in the show notes. Subscribe in your podcast player to catch every episode. And if you enjoyed this one, tell somebody who can't get enough great books to read. That's an addiction we support without reservation. Kobo in Conversation is produced and hosted this time around by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you so much for listening.